Hello, guys. Um, Good evening. Happy Monday night. Um, we are just gonna chill and read some more um, the Lemony Snicket because there's nothing better to read. Um, let's see. Without much ado, without further ado, I am going to get started. Um, for anybody who is new to my reading streams, I can only respond to the chat after every chapter. So if you comment during the chapter, which I want you to do, I just won't be able to see it for a little bit. So I'm sorry if I can't get back to you right away. But Chapter 6. Bad circumstances have a way of ruining things that would otherwise be pleasant. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans and the movie's Zombie in the Snow. After all afternoon, the three children had sat and worried in the reptile room under the mocking stare of Stefano and the oblivious the word oblivious here means not aware that Stefano was really Count Olaf and thus being in a great deal of danger chatter of Uncle Monty. So by the time it was evening, the siblings were in no mood for cinematic entertainment. Uncle Monty's jeep was really too small to hold him, Stefano and the three orphans, so Klaus and Violet shared a seat, and poor Sonny had to sit on Stefano's filthy lap, but the Baudelaires were too preoccupied to even notice their discomfort. The children sat all in a row at the multiplex, with Uncle Monty to one side, while Stefano sat in the middle and hogged the popcorn. But the children were too anxious to eat any snacks and too busy trying to figure out what Stefano planned to do to enjoy Zombies in the Snow, which was a fine film. When the zombies first rose out of the snowbanks surrounding the tiny alpine fishing village, Violet tried to imagine a way in which Stefano could get aboard the Prospero without a ticket and accompany them to Peru. When the town fathers constructed a barrier of sturdy oak, only to have the zombies chomp their way through it, Klaus was concerned with exactly what Stefano had meant when he spoke about accidents. And when Gerda, the little milkmaid, made friends with the zombies and asked them to please stop eating the villagers, Sonny, who was of course scarcely old enough to comprehend the orphan situation, tried to think of a way to defeat Stefano's plans, whatever they were. In the final scene of the movie, the zombies and villagers celebrated May Day together, but the three Baudelaire orphans were too nervous and afraid to enjoy themselves one bit. On the way home, Uncle Monty tried to talk to the silent, worried children sitting in the back, but they hardly said a word in reply, and eventually he fell silent. When the jeep pulled up to the snake-shaped hedges, the Baudelaire children dashed out and ran to the front door without even saying good night to their puzzled guardian. With heavy hearts, they climbed the stairs to their bedrooms, but when they reached their doors, they could not bear to part. "Could we all spend the night in the same room?" Klaus asked Violet timidly. "Last night I felt as if I were in a jail cell, worrying all by myself." "Me too," Violet admitted. "Since we're not going to sleep, we might as well not sleep in the same place." "Tico," Sunny agreed, and followed her siblings into Violet's room. Violet looked around the bedroom and remembered how excited she had been to move into it just a short while ago. Now the enormous window with the view of the snake-shaped hedges seemed depressing rather than inspiring, and the blank pages tacked to her wall rather than being convenient seemed only to remind her of how anxious she was. "I see you haven't worked much on your inventions," Klaus said gently. "I haven't been reading at all. When Count Olaf is around, it puts a damper on the imagination." "Not always," Violet pointed out. "When we lived with him, you read all about nuptial law to find out about his plan, and I invented a grappling hook to put a stop to it. In this situation, though," Klaus said glumly, "we don't even know what Count Olaf is up to. How can we formulate a plan if we don't know his plan?" "Well, let's try to hash this out," Violet said, using an expression which here means talk about something at length until we completely understand it. "Count Olaf, calling himself Stefano, has come to this house in disguise and is obviously after the Baudelaire fortune. And," Klaus continued, "once he gets his hands on it, he plans to kill us." "Tadu," Sonny murmured solemnly, which probably meant something along the lines of, "It's a loathsome situation in which we find ourselves." "However," Violet said, "if he harms us, there's no way he can get to our fortune. That's why he tried to marry me last time." "Thank God that didn't work," Klaus said, shivering. "Then Count Olaf would be my brother-in-law. But this time he's not planning to marry you. He said something about an accident." And about heading to a location where crimes are more difficult to trace, Violet said, remembering his words. That must mean Peru. But Stefano isn't going to Peru. Uncle Monty tore up his ticket. Doog! Sunny shrieked in a generic cry of frustration and pounded her little fist on the floor. The word generic here means when one is unable to think of anything else to say. And Sunny was not alone in this. Violet and Klaus were of course too old to say things like Doog, but they wished they weren't. They wished they could figure out Count Olaf's plan. They wished their situation didn't seem as mysterious and hopeless as it did, and they wished that they were young enough to simply shriek Doog and pound their fists on the floor. And most of all, of course, they wished that their parents were alive and that the Baudelaires were all safe in the home in which they had been born. And as fervently as the Baudelaire orphans wished their circumstances were different, I wish that I could somehow change the circumstances of this story for you. Even as I sit here, safe as can be, and so very far from Count Olaf, I can scarcely bear to write another word. Perhaps it would be best if you shut this book right now and never read the rest of this horrifying story. You can imagine, if you wish, that an hour later, the Baudelaire orphans suddenly figured out what Stefano was up to and were able to save Uncle Monty's life. You can picture the police arriving with all their flashing lights and sirens, and dragging Stefano away to jail for the rest of his life. You can pretend, even though it is not so, that the Baudelaires are living happily with Uncle Monty to this day. Or best of all, you can conjure up the illusion that the Baudelaire parents have not been killed, and that the terrible fire and Count Olaf and Uncle Monty and all the other unfortunate events are nothing more than a dream, a figment of the imagination. But this story is not a happy one, and I am not happy to tell you that the Baudelaire orphans sat dumbly in Violet's room. The word dumbly here means without speaking, rather than in a stupid way, for the rest of the night. Had someone peeped through the bedroom window as the morning sun rose, they would have seen 3 children huddled together on the bed, their eyes wide open and dark with worry. But nobody peeped through the window. Somebody knocked on the door. 4 loud knocks as if something were being nailed shut. The children blinked and looked at one another. "Who is it?" Klaus called out, his voice crackly from being silent so long. Instead of an answer, whoever it was simply turned the knob and the door swung slowly open. There stood Stefano, with his clothes all rumpled and his eyes shining brighter than they ever had before. "Good morning," he said. "It's time to leave for Peru. There's just room for 3 orphans and myself in the jeep, so get a move on." "We told you yesterday that you weren't going," Violet said. She hoped her voice sounded braver than she felt. "It is your Uncle Monty who isn't going," Stefano said, and raised the part of his forehead where his eyebrow should have been. "It is your Don't be ridiculous," Klaus said. "Uncle Monty wouldn't miss this expedition for the world." "Ask him," Stefano said, and the Baudelaire saw a familiar expression in his face. His mouth scarcely moved, but his eyes were shining as if he'd just told a joke. "Why don't you ask him? He's down in the Reptile Room." "We will ask him," Violet said. "Uncle Monty has no intention of letting you take us to Peru alone." She rose from the bed, took the hands of her siblings, and walked quickly past Stefano, who was smirking in the doorway. "We will ask him," Violet said again, and Stefano gave a little bow as the children walked out of the room. The hallway was strangely quiet, and blank as the eyes of a skull. "Uncle Monty?" Violet called at the end of the hallway. Nobody answered. Aside from a few creaks on the steps, the whole house was eerily quiet, as if it had been deserted for many years. "Uncle Monty?" Klaus called at the bottom of the stairs. They heard nothing. Standing on tiptoe, Violet opened the enormous door of the Reptile Room, and for a moment the orphans stared into the room as if hypnotized, entranced by the odd blue light which the sunrise made as it shone through the glass ceiling and walls. In the dim glow they could see only silhouettes of the various reptiles as they moved around in their cages, or slept, curled into shapeless dark masses. Their footsteps echoing off the glimmering walls, the 3 siblings walked through the Reptile Room, toward the far end, where Uncle Monty's library lay waiting for them. Even though the dark room felt mysterious and strange, it was a comforting mystery and a safe strangeness. They remembered Uncle Monty's promise that if they took time to learn the facts, no harm would come to them here in the Reptile Room. However, you and I remember that Uncle Monty's promise was laden with dramatic irony, and now here in the early morning gloom of the Reptile Room, that irony was going to come to fruition, a phrase which here means the Baudelaires were finally to learn of it. For just as they reached the books, the 3 siblings could see a large, shadowy mass huddled in the far corner. Nervously, Klaus switched on one of the reading lamps to get a better look. The shadowy mass was Uncle Monty. His mouth was slightly agape as if he were surprised, and his eyes were wide open, but he didn't appear to see them. His face, usually so rosy, was very, very pale, and under his left eye were two small holes, right in a line, the sort of mark made by the two fangs of a snake. "Devo sum?" Sonny asked and tugged at his pant leg. Uncle Monty did not move. As he had promised, no harm had come to the Baudelaire orphans in the Reptile Room, but great harm had come to Uncle Monty. Chapter 7. My, said a voice from behind them, and the Baudelaire orphans turned to find Stefano standing there, the black suitcase with the shiny silver padlock in his hands and a look of brummagem surprise on his face. Brummagem is a rare word for fake, that even Klaus didn't know what it meant, but the children did not have to be told that Stefano was pretending to be surprised. "What a terrible accident has happened here! Snakebite. Whoever discovers this will be most upset." "You—" Violet began to say, but her throat fluttered as if the fact of Uncle Monty's death were food that tasted terrible. "You—" she said again. Stefano took no notice. "Of course, after they discover that Dr. Montgomery is dead, they'll wonder what became of those repulsive orphans he had laying around the house. But they'll be long gone. Speaking of which, it's time to leave. The Prospero sails at 5 o'clock from Hazy Harbor, and I'd like to be the first passenger aboard. That way I'll have time for a bottle of wine before lunch." "How could you?" Klaus whispered hoarsely. He couldn't take his eyes off Uncle Monty's pale, pale face. "How could you do this? How could you murder him?" "Why, Klaus, I'm surprised," Stefano said, and walked over to Uncle Monty's body. "A smarty-pants boy like you should be able to figure out that your chubby old uncle died from snakebite, not from murder. Look at those teeth marks. Look at his pale, pale face. Look at those staring eyes." "Stop it!" Violet said. "Don't talk like that." "You're right," Stefano said. "There's no time for chit-chat. We have a ship to catch. Let's move." "We're not going anywhere with you," Klaus said. His face was pinched with the effort of focusing on their predicament rather than going to pieces. "We will stay here until the police come." "And how do you suppose the police will know to come?" Stefano said. "We will call them," Klaus said in what he hoped was a firm tone of voice, and began to walk toward the door. Stefano dropped his suitcase, the shiny silver padlock making a clattering sound as it hit the marble floor. He took a few steps and blocked Klaus's way, his eyes wide and red with fury. "I am so tired," Stefano snarled, "of having to explain everything to you. You're supposed to be so very smart, and yet you always seem to forget about this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the jagged knife. "This is my knife. It is very sharp and very eager to hurt you, almost as eager as I am. If you don't do what I say, you will suffer bodily harm. Is that clear enough for you? Now get in the Jeep." It is, as you know, very, very rude, and usually unnecessary to use profanity, but the Baudelaire orphans were too terrified to point out that Stefano used profanity. Taking a last look at their poor Uncle Monty, the three children followed Stefano to the door of the Reptile Room to get in the Jeep. To add insult to injury, a phrase which here means forcing somebody to do an unpleasant task when they're already very upset, Stefano forced Violet to carry his suitcase out of the house, but she was too lost in her own thoughts to care. She was remembering the last conversation she and her siblings had with Uncle Monty, and thinking with a cold rush of shame that it hadn't really been a conversation at all. You will recall, of course, that on the ride home from seeing zombies in the snow, the children had been so worried about Stefano that they hadn't said a word to Uncle Monty, and that when the Jeep had arrived at the house, the Baudelaire orphans had dashed upstairs to hash out the situation, without even saying good night to the man who now lay dead under a sheet in the Reptile Room. As the youngsters reached the Jeep, Violet tried to remember if they had even thanked him for taking them to the movies, but the night was all still a blur. She thought that she, Klaus, and Sonny had probably said, "Thank you, Uncle Monty," when they were standing together at the ticket booth, but she couldn't be sure. Stefano opened the door of the Jeep and gestured with the knife, ushering Klaus and Sonny into the tiny back seat, and Violet, the black suitcase heavy on her lap, into the front seat beside him. The orphans had a brief hope that the engine would not start when Stefano turned the key in the ignition, but this was a futile hope. Uncle Monty took good care of his Jeep, and it started right up. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny looked behind them. as Stefano began to drive alongside the snake-shaped hedges. At the side of the reptile room, which Uncle Monty had filled so carefully with his specimens and in which he was now a sort of specimen himself, the weight of the Baudelaires' despair was too much for them, and they quietly began to cry. It was a curious thing, the death of a loved one. We all know that our time in this world is limited, and that eventually all of us will end up underneath some sheet never to wake up, and yet it's always a surprise when it happens to someone we know. It is like walking up the stairs to your bedroom in the dark, and thinking that there is one more stair than there is. Your foot falls down through the air, and there is a sickly moment of dark surprise as you try to readjust the way you thought of things. The Baudelaire orphans were crying not only for their Uncle Monty, but for their own parents, and this dark and curious feeling of falling that accompanies any great loss. What was to happen to them? Stefano had heartlessly slaughtered the man who was supposed to be watching over the Baudelaires, and now they were all alone. What would Stefano do to them? He was supposed to be left behind when they went to Peru, and now he would be leaving with them on the Prospero. And what terrible things would happen in Peru? Would anyone rescue them there? Would Stefano get his hands on the fortune, and what would happen to the 3 children afterward? These are frightening questions, and if you are thinking about such matters, they require your full attention, and the orphans were so immersed in thinking about them they didn't realize that Stefano was about to collide with another automobile until the moment of impact. There was a horrible tearing sound of metal and glass as a black car crashed into Uncle Monty's Jeep, throwing the children to the floor with a jarring thump that felt as though it left the Baudelaire stomachs up on the seat. The black suitcase lurched into Violet's shoulder, and then forward into the windshield, which immediately cracked in a dozen places so it looked like a spider web. Stefano gave a cry of surprise and turned the steering wheel this way and that, but the 2 vehicles were locked together and with another thump veered off the road into a small pile of mud. It is a rare occurrence when a car accident can be called a stroke of good fortune, but that was most certainly the case here. With the snake-shaped hedges still clearly visible behind them, the Baudelaire's journey toward Hazy Harbor had stopped. Stefano gave another sharp cry, this one of rage. "Blasted furnaces of hell!" he shouted, as Violet rubbed her shoulder to make sure she wasn't seriously hurt. Klaus and Sonny got up cautiously from the Jeep floor and looked out the cracked windshield. There appeared to be only one person in the other car, but it was hard to tell, as the vehicle had clearly suffered much more damage than Monty's Jeep. Its entire front had pleated itself together like an accordion, and one hubcap was spinning noisily on the pavement of Lousy Lane, making blurry circles as if it were a giant coin somebody had just dropped. The driver was dressed in gray and making a rough hacking sound as he opened the crumpled door of the car and struggled his way out. He made the hacking sound again and then reached into a pocket of his suit and pulled out a white handkerchief. "It's Mr. Poe!" Klaus cried. It was Mr. Poe, coughing away as usual, and the children were so delighted to see him they found themselves smiling despite their horrible circumstances. "Mr. Poe! Mr. Poe!" Violet cried, reaching around Stefano's suitcase to open the passenger door. Stefano reached out an arm and grabbed her sore shoulder, turning his head slowly so that each child saw his shiny eyes. "This changes nothing," he hissed at them. "This is a bit of luck for you, but it is your last. The 3 of you will be back in this car with me and heading toward Hazy Harbor in time to catch the Prospero, I promise you." "We'll see about that," Violet replied, opening the door and sliding out from beneath the suitcase. Klaus opened his door and followed her, carrying Sonny. "Mr. Poe! Mr. Poe!" "Violet?" Mr. Poe asked. "Violet Baudelaire, is that you?" "Yes, Mr. Poe," Violet said. "It's all of us, and we're so grateful you ran into us like this." "Well, I wouldn't say that," Mr. Poe said. "This was clearly the other driver's fault. You ran into me." "How dare you!" Stefano shouted and got out of the car himself, wrinkling his nose at the smell of horseradish that filled the air. He stomped over to where Mr. Poe was standing, but halfway there the children saw his face change from one of pure rage to one of brummagem confusion and sadness. "I'm sorry," he said in a high, fluttery voice. "This whole thing is my fault. I'm so distressed by what has happened that I wasn't paying any attention to the rules of the road. I hope you're not hurt, Mr. Poe." "It's Poe," Mr. Poe said. "My name is Poe. I'm not hurt. Luckily, it looks like nobody was hurt. I wish the same could be said for my car, but who are you? And what are you doing with the Baudelaire children?" "I'll tell you who he is," Klaus said. "Please, Klaus," Mr. Poe admonished, a word which here means reprimanded Klaus even though he was interrupting for a very good reason. "It's not polite to interrupt." "My name is Stefano," Stefano said, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. I was Dr. Montgomery's assistant." "What do you mean, was?" Mr. Poe asked sternly. "Were you fired?" "No." Dr. Montgomery... "Oh, excuse me." Stefano turned away and pretended to dab at his eyes as if he were too sad to continue. Facing away from Mr. Poe, he gave the orphans a big wink before continuing. I'm sorry to tell you, there's been a horrible accident, Mr. Doe. Mr. Montgomery is dead. Poe, Mr. Poe said. He's dead? That's terrible. What's happened? I don't know, Stefano said. It looks like snake bite to me, but I don't know anything about snakes. That's why I was going into town to get a doctor. The children seemed too upset to be left alone. He's not taking us to get a doctor, Klaus shouted. He's taking us to Peru. You see what I mean? Stefano said to Mr. Poe, patting Klaus's head. The children are obviously very distressed. Dr. Montgomery was going to take them to Peru today. Yes, I know, Mr. Poe said. That's why I hurried over here this morning to finally bring them their luggage. Klaus, I know you're confused and upset over this accident, but please try to understand that if Dr. Montgomery is really dead, the expedition is cancelled. But Mr. Poe, Klaus said indignantly. Please, Mr. Poe said. This is a matter for adults to discuss, Klaus. Clearly a doctor needs to be called. Well, why don't you drive on up to the house, Stefano said, and I'll take the children to find a doctor. Jose! Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, no way. Why don't we all go to the house, Mr. Poe said, and call for a doctor? Stefano blinked, and for a second his face grew angry again before he was able to calm himself and answer smoothly. Of course, he said. I should have called earlier. Obviously, I'm not thinking as clearly as you. Here, children, get back in the jeep and Mr. Poe will follow us. We're not getting back in that car with you, Klaus said firmly. Please, Klaus, Mr. Poe said. Try to understand there's been a serious accident. All other discussions will have to be put aside. The only trouble is I'm not sure that my car will start. It's very smashed up. Try the ignition, Stefano said. Mr. Poe nodded and walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine made a rough, wet noise. Sounded quite a bit like Mr. Poe's coughs, but it did not start. I'm afraid the engine is quite dead, Mr. Poe called out. And before long, Stefano muttered to the children, You will be too. I'm sorry, Mr. Poe said. I couldn't hear you. Stefano smiled. I said that's too bad. Well, why don't I take the orphans back to the house and you walk behind us? There isn't room for everyone. Mr. Poe frowned. But the children's suitcases are here. I don't want to leave them unattended. Why don't we put the luggage into your car, and the children and I will walk back to the house? Stefano frowned. Well, one of the children should ride with me so I won't get lost. Mr. Poe smiled. You can see the house from here. You won't get lost. Stefano doesn't want us to be alone with you, Violet said, finally speaking up. She had been waiting for the proper moment to make her case. He's afraid that we'll tell you who he really is and what he's really up to. What's she talking about? Mr. Poe asked Stefano. I have no idea, Mr. Toe, Stefano replied, shaking his head and looking at Violet fiercely. Violet took a deep breath. This man is not Stefano, she said, pointing at him. He's Count Olaf, and he's here to take us away. Who am I? Stefano asked. What am I doing? Mr. Poe looked Stefano up and down and shook his head. Forgive the children, he said. They're very upset. Count Olaf is a terrible man who tried to steal their money, and the youngsters are very frightened of him. Do I look like this Count Olaf? Stefano asked, his eyes shining. No, you don't, Mr. Poe said. Count Olaf had one long eyebrow and a clean-shaven face. You have a beard, and if you don't mind my saying so, no eyebrows at all. He shaved his eyebrow, Violet said, and grew a beard. Anyone can see that. And he has the tattoo, Klaus cried. The eye tattoo on his ankle. Look at the tattoo. Mr. Poe looked at Stefano and shrugged apologetically. I'm sorry to ask you this, he said, but the children just seem so upset, and before we discuss anything further, I'd like to set their minds at ease. Would you mind showing me your ankle? I'd be happy to, Stefano said, giving the children a toothy smile. Right or left? Klaus closed his eyes and thought for a second. Left, he said. Stefano placed his left foot on the bumper of Uncle Monty's jeep. Looking at the Baudelaire orphans with his shiny eyes, he began to raise the leg of his stained striped pants. Violet, Klaus, Sonny, and Mr. Poe all kept their eyes on Stefano's ankle. The pant leg went up, like a curtain rising to begin a play, but there was no tattoo of an eye to be seen. The Baudelaire orphans stared at a patch of smooth skin as blank and pale as poor Uncle Monty's face. Chapter 8. While the jeep sputtered ahead of them, the Baudelaire orphans trudged back toward Uncle Monty's house. the scent of horseradish in their nostrils, and a feeling of frustration in their hearts. It is very unnerving to be proven wrong, particularly when you are really right, and the person who is really wrong is the one who is proving you wrong and proving himself wrongly right. Right? I don't know how he got rid of his tattoo, Klaus said stubbornly to Mr. Poe, who was coughing into his handkerchief, but that is definitely Count Olaf. Klaus, Mr. Poe said when he had stopped coughing, this is getting very tiresome, going over this again and again. We have just seen Stefano's unblemished angle. Unblemished means, we know what unblemished means, Klaus said, watching Stefano get out of Uncle Monty's jeep and walk quickly into the house. Without tattoos, but it is Count Olaf. Why can't you see that? All I can see, Mr. Poe said, is what's in front of me. I see a man with no eyebrows, a beard, and no tattoo, and that's not Count Olaf. Anyway, even if by some chance this Stefano wishes you harm, you have nothing to fear. It is quite shocking that Dr. Montgomery has died, but we're not simply going to hand over you and your fortune to his assistant. Why, this man can't even remember my name. Klaus looked at his siblings and sighed. It would be easier, they realized, to argue with the snake-shaped hedge than with Mr. Poe when he had made up his mind. Violet was about to try reasoning with him one more time when a horn honked behind them. The Baudelaires and Mr. Poe got out of the way with the approaching automobile, a small gray car with a very skinny driver. The car stopped in front of the house and the skinny person got out, a tall man in a white coat. May we help you? Mr. Poe called as he and the children approached. I am Dr. Lucafont, the tall man said, pointing to himself with a big, solid hand. I received a call that there's been a terrible accident involving a snake. You're here already? Mr. Poe asked, but Stefano has scarcely had time to call, let alone for you to drive here. I believe that speed is of the essence in an emergency, don't you? Dr. Lucafont said. If an autopsy is to be performed, it should be done immediately. Of course, Mr. Poe said quickly. I was just surprised. Where is the body? Dr. Lucafont asked, walking toward the door. Stefano can tell you, Mr. Poe said, opening the door of the house. Stefano was waiting in the entryway, holding a coffee pot. I'm going to make some coffee, he said. Who wants some? I'll have a cup, Dr. Lucafont said. Nothing like a hearty cup of coffee before starting the day's work. Mr. Poe frowned. Shouldn't you take a look at Dr. Montgomery first? Yes, Dr. Lucafont, Stefano said. Time is of the essence in an emergency, don't you think? Yes, I suppose you're right, Dr. Lucafont said. Poor Dr. Montgomery is in the Reptile Room, Stefano said, gesturing to where the Baudelaire's guardian still lay. Please do a thorough examination, and then you may have some coffee. You're the boss, Dr. Lucafont said, opening the door of the Reptile Room with an oddly stiff hand. Stefano led Mr. Poe into the kitchen, and the Baudelaires glumly followed. When one feels useless and unable to help, one can use the expression feeling like a fifth wheel, because if something has four wheels, such as a wagon or a car, there is no need for a fifth. As Stefano brewed coffee for the adults, the three children sat down at the kitchen table where they had first had coconut cake with Monty just a short time ago, and Violet, Klaus, and Sonny felt like a fifth, sixth, and seventh wheel on a car that was going the wrong direction, toward Hazy Harbor and the departing Prospero. When I spoke to Dr. Lucafont on the phone, Stefano said, I told him about the accident with your car. When he is done with his medical examination, he will drive you into town to get a mechanic, and I will stay here with the orphans. No, Klaus said firmly. We're not staying alone with him for an instant. Mr. Poe smiled as Stefano poured him a cup of coffee and looked sternly at Klaus. Klaus, I realize you are very upset, but it is inexcusable for you to keep treating Stefano so rudely. Please apologize to him at once. No! Klaus cried. That's quite all right, Mr. Yo, Stefano said soothingly. The children are upset over Dr. Montgomery's murder, so I don't expect them to be on their best behavior. Murder? Violet said. She turned to Stefano and tried to look as if she were merely politely curious instead of enraged. Why did you say murder, Stefano? Stefano's face darkened, and his hands clenched at his sides. It looked like there was nothing he wanted to do more than scratch out Violet's eyes. I misspoke, he said finally. Of course he did, Mr. Poe said, sipping from his cup. But the children can come with Dr. Lucafont and me if they feel more comfortable that way. I'm not sure they will fit, Stefano said, his eyes shining. It's a very small car. But if the orphans would rather, they could come with me in the jeep, and we could follow you and Dr. Lucafont to the mechanic. The three orphans looked at one another and thought hard. Their situation seemed like a game, although this game had desperately high stakes. The object of the game was not to end up alone with Stefano, for when they did, he would whisk them away on the Prospero. What would happen then, when they were alone in Peru with such a greedy and despicable person, they did not want to think about. What they had to think about was stopping it from happening. It seemed incredible that their very lives hinged on a carpooling conversation, but in life it is often the tiny details that end up being the most important. "Why don't we ride with Dr. Lucafont?" Violet said carefully, "and Mr. Poe can ride with Stefano." "Whatever for?" Mr. Poe asked. "I've always wanted to see the inside of a doctor's automobile," Violet said, knowing that this was a fairly lame invention. "Oh, yes, me too," Klaus said. "Please, can't we ride with Dr. Lucafont?" "I'm afraid not," Dr. Lucafont said from the doorway, surprising everyone. "Not all three of you children, anyway. I have placed Dr. Montgomery's body in my car, which only leaves room for 2 more passengers." "Have you already completed your examination?" Mr. Poe asked. "The preliminary one, yes," Dr. Lucafont said. "I will have to take the body for some further tests, but my autopsy shows that the doctor died of snakebite. Is there any coffee left for me?" "Of course," Stefano answered and poured him a cup. "How can you be so sure?" Violet asked the doctor. "What do you mean?" Dr. Lucafont said quizzically. "I can be sure there's coffee left because I see it right here." "What I think Violet means," Mr. Poe said, "is how can you be sure that Dr. Montgomery died of snakebite? In his veins I found the venom of the mamba du mal, one of the world's most poisonous snakes." "Does this mean that there's a poisonous snake loose in this house?" Mr. Poe asked. No, Dr. Lucafont said. "The mamba du mal is safe in its cage. It must have gotten out, bitten Dr. Montgomery, and locked itself up again." "What?" Violet asked. "That is a ridiculous theory. A snake cannot operate a lock by itself." "Perhaps other snakes helped it," Dr. Lucafont said calmly, sipping his coffee. "Is there anything here to eat? I had to rush over here without my breakfast." "Your story does seem a little odd," Mr. Poe said. He looked questioningly at Dr. Lucafont, who was opening a cupboard and peering inside. "Terrible accidents I have found are often odd," he replied. "It can't have been an accident," Violet said. "Uncle Monty is—" She stopped. "Uncle Monty was one of the world's most respected herpetologists. He never would have kept a poisonous snake in a cage it could open itself." "If it wasn't an accident," Dr. Lucafont said, "then someone would have had to do this on purpose. Obviously you 3 children didn't kill him, and the only other person in the house was Stefano." "And I," Stefano added quickly, "hardly know anything about snakes. I've only been working here for 2 days and scarcely had time to learn anything." "It certainly appears to be an accident," Mr. Poe said. "I'm sorry, children. Dr. Montgomery seemed like an appropriate guardian for you." "He was more than that," Violet said quietly. "He was much, much more than that." "That's Uncle Monty's food!" Klaus cried out suddenly, his face contorted in anger. He pointed at Dr. Lucafont, who had taken a can out of the cupboard. "Stop eating his food!" "I was only going to have a few peaches," Dr. Lucafont said. With one of his oddly solid hands, he held up a can of peaches Uncle Monty had bought only yesterday. "Please," Mr. Poe said gently to Dr. Lucafont. "The children are very upset. I'm sure you can understand that. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny, why don't you excuse yourselves for a little while? We have much to discuss, and you are obviously too overwrought to participate. Now, Dr. Lucafont, let's try and figure this out. You have room for 3 passengers, including Dr. Montgomery's body. And you, Stefano, have room for 3 passengers as well." "So it's very simple," Stefano said. "You and the corpse will go in Dr. Lucafont's car, and I will drive behind you with the children." "No," Klaus said firmly. "Baudelaires," Mr. Poe said just as firmly, "will you 3 please excuse yourselves?" "A foop!" Sunny shrieked, which probably meant no. "Of course we will," Violet said, giving Klaus and Sunny a significant look and taking her siblings' hands. She half led them, half dragged them out of the kitchen. Klaus and Sunny looked up at their older sister and saw that something about her had changed. Her face looked more determined than grief-stricken, and she walked quickly, as if she were late for something. You will remember, of course, that even years later, Klaus would lie awake in bed, filled with regret that he didn't call out to the driver of the taxicab who brought Stefano into their lives once more. But in this respect Violet was luckier than her brother. For unlike Klaus, who was so surprised when he first recognized Stefano that the moment to act passed him by, Violet realized as she heard the adults drone on that the time to act was now. I cannot say that Violet, years later, slept easily when she looked back on her life. There were too many miserable times for any of the Baudelaires to be peaceful sleepers. But she was always a bit proud of herself that she realized she and her siblings should in fact excuse themselves from the kitchen and move to a more helpful location. "What are we doing?" Klaus asked. "Where are we going?" Sunny too looked questioningly at her sister, but Violet merely shook her head in answer and walked faster toward the door of the reptile room. I think I'll do one more chapter tonight. Chapter 9. When Violet opened the enormous door of the reptile room, the reptiles were still there in their cages, the books were still on their shelves, and the morning sun was still streaming through glass walls, but the place simply wasn't the same. Even though Dr. Lucafont had removed Uncle Monty's body, the reptile room was not as inviting as it used to be and probably never would be. What happens in a certain place can stain your feelings for that location just as ink can stain a white sheet. You can wash it and still never forget what has transpired, a word which here means happened and made everybody sad. "I don't want to go in," Klaus said. "Uncle Monty died in here." "I know we don't want to be here," Violet said, "but we have work to do." "Work?" Klaus asked. "What work?" Violet gritted her teeth. "We have work to do," she said, "that Mr. Poe should be doing, but as usual he is well-intentioned but of no real help." Klaus and Sunny sighed as she spoke out loud, a sentiment all three siblings had never said, but always felt, since Mr. Poe had taken over their affairs. Mr. Poe doesn't believe that Stefano and Count Olaf are the same person, and he believes that Uncle Monty's death was an accident. We have to prove him wrong on both counts. "But Stefano doesn't have the tattoo," Klaus pointed out, "and Dr. Lucafont found the venom of the Mamba du Mal in Monty's veins." I know," Violet said impatiently. "The three of us know the truth, but in order to convince the adults we have to find evidence and proof of Stefano's plan." "If only we'd found evidence and proof earlier," Klaus said glumly, "then maybe we could have saved Uncle Monty's life." "We'll never know about that," Violet said quietly. She looked around at the reptile room which Monty had worked on his whole life. "But if we put Stefano behind bars for his murder, we'll at least be able to prevent him from harming anyone else." "Including us," Klaus pointed out. "Including us," Violet agreed. Now Klaus found all of Uncle Monty's books that might contain information about the Mamba du Mal. "Let me know when you find anything." "But all that research could take days," Klaus said, looking at Monty's considerable library. "Well, we don't have days," Violet said firmly. "We don't even have hours. At 5 o'clock the Prospero leaves Hazy Harbor, and Stefano is going to do everything he can to make sure we're on that ship, and if we end up alone in Peru with him—" All right, Klaus said. "Let's get started. Here, you take this book." "I'm not taking any book," Violet said. "While you're in the library, I'm going up to Stefano's room to see if I can find any clues." "Alone?" Klaus asked. "In his room?" "It'll be perfectly safe," Violet said, although she knew nothing of the kind. "Get cracking with the books, Klaus. Sunny, watch the door and bite anyone who tries to get in." "Ackroyd," Sunny said, which probably meant something like Roger. Violet left, and true to her word, Sunny sat near the door with her teeth bared. Klaus walked to the far end of the room where the library was, carefully avoiding the aisle where the poisonous snakes were kept. He didn't even want to look at the Mamba du Mal or any deadly reptile. Even though Klaus knew that Uncle Monty's death was the fault of Stefano and not really of the snake, he could not bear to look at the reptile who'd put an end to the happy times he and his sister had enjoyed. Klaus sighed and opened the book, and as at so many times when the middle Baudelaire child did not want to think about his circumstances, he began to read. "It is now necessary for me to use the rather hackneyed phrase, 'meanwhile back at the ranch.' The word hackneyed here means used by so many writers that by the time Lemony Snicket uses it, it's a tiresome cliché. Meanwhile back at the ranch is a phrase used to link what is going on in one part of the story to what is going on in another part of the story, and it has nothing to do with cows or with horses or with any people who work in rural areas where ranches are, or even with ranch dressing, which is creamy and put on salads. Here the phrase 'meanwhile back at the ranch' refers to what Violet was doing, while Klaus and Sunny were in the reptile room. For as Klaus began his research in Uncle Monty's library, and Sunny guarded the door with her sharp teeth, Violet was up to something I am sure will be of interest to you. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Violet went to listen at the kitchen door, trying to catch what the adults were saying. As I'm sure you know, the key to good eavesdropping is not getting caught, and Violet moved as quietly as she could, trying not to step on any creaky parts of the floor. When she reached the door of the kitchen, she took her hair ribbon out of her pocket and dropped it on the floor. so if anyone opened the door, she could claim she was kneeling down to pick it up rather than to eavesdrop. This was a trick she had learned when she was very small, when she would listen at her parents' bedroom door to hear what they might be planning for her birthday, and like all good tricks, it still worked. "But Mr. Poe, if Stefano rides with me in my car and you drive Dr. Montgomery's Jeep," Dr. Lucafont was saying, "then how will you know the way?" "I see your point," Mr. Poe said, "but I don't think Sonny will be willing to sit on Dr. Montgomery's lap if he's dead. We'll have to work out another way." "I've got it," Stefano said. "I will drive the children in Dr. Lucafont's car, and Dr. Lucafont can go with you and Dr. Montgomery in Dr. Montgomery's Jeep." "I'm afraid that won't work," Dr. Lucafont said gravely. "The city laws won't allow anybody else to drive my car." "And we haven't even discussed the issue of the children's luggage," Mr. Poe said. Violet stood up, having heard enough to know she had enough time to go to Stefano's room. Quietly, Violet walked up the staircase and down the hallway toward Stefano's door, where he sat holding a knife that fearsome night. When she reached his door, Violet stopped. It was amazing, she thought, how everything having to do with Count Olaf was frightening. He was such a terrible person that merely the sight of his bedroom door could get her heart pounding. Violet found herself half hoping that Stefano would bound up the stairs and stop her just so she wouldn't have to open his door and go into the room where he slept. But then Violet thought of her own safety, and the safety of her two siblings. If one's safety is threatened, one often finds courage one didn't know one had, and the eldest Baudelaire found she could be brave enough to open the door. Her shoulders still aching from the car collision, Violet turned the brass handle of the door and walked inside. The room, as Violet suspected, was a dirty mess. The bed was unmade and had cracker crumbs and bits of hair all over it. Discarded newspapers and mail-order catalogs lay on the floor in untidy piles. On top of the dresser was a small assortment of half-empty wine bottles. The closet door was open, revealing a bunch of rusty wire coat hangers that shivered in the drafty room. The curtains over the windows were all bunched up and encrusted with something flaky, and Violet drew closer. She realized with faint horror that Stefano had blown his nose on them. But although it was disgusting, hardened phlegm was not the sort of evidence that Violet was hoping for. The eldest Baudelaire orphan stood in the center of the room and surveyed the sticky disorder of the bedroom. Everything was horrendous. Nothing was helpful. Violet rubbed her sore shoulder and remembered when she and her siblings were living with Count Olaf and found themselves locked in his tower room. Although it was frightening to be trapped in his inner sanctum, a phrase which here means filthy room in which evil plans are devised, it turned out to be quite useful because they were able to read up on nuptial law and work their way out of their predicament. But here in Stefano's inner sanctum at Uncle Monty's house, all Violet could find were signs of uncleanliness. Somewhere, Stefano must have left a trail of evidence that Violet could find and use to convince Mr. Poe. But where was it? Disheartened and afraid she had spent too much time in Stefano's bedroom, Violet went quickly back downstairs. "No, no, no," Mr. Poe was saying when she stopped to listen at the kitchen door again. "Dr. Montgomery can't drive. He is dead. There must be a way to do this." "I've told you over and over," Stefano said, and Violet could tell he was growing angry. "The easiest way is for me to take the 3 children into town while you follow with Dr. Lucafont and the corpse. What could be simpler?" "Perhaps you're right," Mr. Poe said with a sigh, and Violet hurried into the reptile room. "Klaus, Klaus," she cried, "tell me you found something. I went to Stefano's room, but there's nothing that can help us, and I think Stefano's going to get us alone in his car." Klaus smiled for an answer, and began to read out loud from the book he was holding. "The Mamba du Mal," he said, "is one of the deadliest snakes in the hemisphere, noted for its strangulatory grip, used in conjunction with its deadly venom, giving all of its victims a tenebrous hue, which is ghastly to behold." "Strangulatory? Conjunction? Tenebrous? Hue?" Violet repeated. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "I didn't either," Klaus admitted, "until I looked up some of the words. Strangulatory means having to do with strangling. In conjunction means together. Tenebrous means dark, and hue means color, so the Mamba du Mal is noted for strangling people while it bites them, leaving their corpses dark with bruises." "Stop, stop!" Violet cried, covering her ears. "I don't want to hear any more about what happened to Uncle Monty." "You don't understand," Klaus said gently. "That isn't what happened to Uncle Monty." "But Dr. Lucafont said there was venom of the Mamba du Mal in Monty's veins," she said. "I'm sure there was," Klaus said, "but the snake didn't put it there. If it had, Uncle Monty's body would have been dark with bruises, but you and I remember that it's as pale as can be." Violet started to speak, and then stopped, remembering the pale, pale face of Uncle Monty when they discovered him. "That's true," she said, "but then how was he poisoned?" Remember how Uncle Monty said he kept the venoms of all his poisonous snakes in test tubes to study them? Klaus said. I think Stefano took the venom and injected it into Uncle Monty. Really? Violet shuddered. That's awful. Oh, keepy! Sonny shrieked, apparently in agreement. When we tell Mr. Poe about this, Klaus said confidently, Stefano will be arrested for Uncle Monty's murder and sent to jail. No longer will he try to whisk us away to Peru or threaten us with knives or make us carry his suitcase or anything like that. Violet looked at her brother, her eyes wide with excitement. Suitcase, she said. His suitcase! What are you talking about? Klaus asked quizzically, and Violet was about to explain when there was a knock on the door. Come in, Violet called, signaling to Sonny not to bite Mr. Poe as he walked in. I hope you're feeling a bit calmer, Mr. Poe said, looking at each of the children in turn, and no longer entertaining the thought that Stefano is Count Olaf. When Mr. Poe used the word entertaining, here he meant thinking, rather than singing or dancing or putting on skits. Even if he's not Count Olaf, Klaus said carefully, we think he may be responsible for Uncle Monty's death. Nonsense, Mr. Poe exclaimed, as Violet shook her head at her brother. Uncle Monty's death was a terrible accident and nothing more. Klaus held up the book he was reading. But while you were in the kitchen, we were reading about snakes, and reading about snakes, Mr. Poe said. I should think you'd want to read about anything but snakes after what happened to Dr. Montgomery. But I found out something, Klaus said. That it doesn't matter what you found out about snakes, Mr. Poe said, taking out a handkerchief. The Bodlers waited while he coughed into it before returning it to its pocket. It doesn't matter, he said again, what you found out about snakes. Stefano doesn't know anything about snakes. He told us that himself. But, Klaus said as he stopped when he saw Violet. She shook her head at him again, just slightly. It was a signal, telling him not to say anything more to Mr. Poe. He looked at his sister and then at Mr. Poe and shut his mouth. Mr. Poe coughed slightly into his handkerchief and looked at his wristwatch. Now that we have settled that matter, there is the issue of riding in the car. I know that the three of you were eager to see the inside of a doctor's automobile, but we've discussed it over and over, and there is simply no way it can work. You three are going to ride with Stefano into town, while I will ride with Dr. Lucafont and your Uncle Monty. Stefano and Dr. Lucafont are unloading all the bags now, and we will leave in a few minutes. If you'll excuse me, I have to call the Herpetological Society and tell them the bad news. Mr. Poe coughed once more into his handkerchief and left the room. Why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? Klaus asked Violet when he was sure Mr. Poe was out of earshot, a word which here means close enough to hear them. Violet didn't answer. She was looking through the glass wall of the reptile room, watching Dr. Lucafont and Stefano walk past the snake-shaped hedges to Uncle Monty's jeep. Stefano opened the jeep door, and Dr. Lucafont began to carry suitcases out of the back seat in his strangely stiff hands. Violet, why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? When the adults come to fetch us, Violet said, ignoring Klaus's question. Keep them in the reptile room till I get back. But how will I do that? Klaus asked. Create a distraction, Violet answered impatiently, still looking out the window at the little pile of suitcases Dr. Lucafont was making. What distraction? Klaus asked anxiously. How? For goodness sake, Klaus, his older sister replied. You have read hundreds of books. Surely you must have read something about creating a distraction. Klaus thought for a second. In order to win the Trojan War, he said, the ancient Greeks had hid soldiers inside of an enormous wooden horse. That was a sort of distraction, but I don't have time to build a wooden horse. Then you'll have to think of something else, Violet said, and began to walk toward the door, still gazing out the window. Klaus and Sonny looked first at their sister and then out the window of the reptile room in the direction she was looking. It is remarkable that different people will have different thoughts when they look at the same thing. It is... For when the two younger Baudelaires looked at the pile of suitcases, all they thought was that, unless they did something quickly, they would end up alone in Uncle Monty's jeep with Stefano. But from the way Violet was staring as she walked out of the reptile room, she was obviously thinking something else. Klaus and Sonny could not imagine what it was, but somehow their sister had reached a different conclusion as she looked at her own brown suitcase, or perhaps the beige one that held Klaus's things, or the tiny gray one that was Sonny's, or maybe the large black one with the shiny silver padlock that belonged to Stefano. That's the end of chapter 9. Welcome to Timo and Brandon and Tom. I think I'm going to call it here for the night, though. Sorry you guys came in kind of late. I finished 9 chapters, so the next time I pick up this book, we'll read chapters 10 through 13. I hope you guys are having a good night, and I will see you again soon. Thank you for popping in and enjoying some Lemony Snicket with me, but I will be back soon. For those of you who follow me, don't forget that Salad's birthday stream is going to be tomorrow night about 7:15 or 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. So come and celebrate Salad's birthday with us at my stream. So I hope you guys have a great night. Thanks again for coming, and I'll see you soon.